Debt, The First 5,000 Years by David Graeber. Picture yourself at a sunny garden party, chatting with a smart, compassionate lawyer who dedicates her life to fighting poverty. You casually mention your activist work, and she asks what you've accomplished. Well, you say, we almost brought down the IMF. She looks puzzled, so you paint the picture. How massive Western banks lured leaders in struggling countries into taking enormous loans. How interest rates exploded overnight, and how the International Monetary Fund swooped in like a collector with a baseball bat, forcing these nations to slash funding for food, healthcare, and schools, just to keep the money flowing. You describe the devastation, families torn apart, societies crumbling, futures erased. So what were you fighting for? She asks. Debt forgiveness, you explain. After 3 decades of money hemorrhaging from the world's poorest to its richest, we thought it was time to hit reset. Then she drops 7 words that sound like the most reasonable thing in the world. But they borrowed the money, surely one has to pay one's debts. That single sentence is why we're here, because what if it's not reasonable at all? What if that idea, which sounds so obviously true, is actually one of history's most dangerous myths? Today, we're diving into a book that tears down that myth, brick by brick. It's called Debt, The First 5,000 Years, by the brilliant, rebellious anthropologist David Graeber. Graeber wasn't just some dusty academic. He was an intellectual powerhouse and a driving force behind Occupy Wall Street, the guy who gave us We Are the 99%. This book is his masterwork, a wild, mind-expanding journey through 5,000 years of human civilization that sold millions of copies and fundamentally rewired how we understand money, morality, and power. Here's my promise. By the time we're done, you'll see that nearly everything you've been taught about money, economics, and the birth of civilization is built on sand. You'll understand that debt isn't just about spreadsheets and interest rates. It's about violence, control, and what it fundamentally means to be human. And that little voice in your head whispering, surely one has to pay one's debts? You might just tell it to shut up. Let's pull back the curtain on the secret history shaping our world. Open any economics textbook, and you'll find the same tidy origin story about money. It goes like this. Long ago, before money existed, people bartered. If you were a baker who needed shoes, you'd have to hunt down a shoemaker who happened to be craving bread at that exact moment. Super inefficient, right? What if the shoemaker wanted a haircut instead? Then you'd need to find a barber who wanted bread and orchestrate some complicated 3-way swap. Absolute chaos. This headache is called the double coincidence of wants. To solve it, clever humans supposedly agreed on one valuable thing, shiny shells, salt, maybe dried fish, that everyone would accept. Boom! Money is born. Eventually, people switched to precious metals, then coins, and way down the line came credit and banking. Nice story. Clean. Logical. And according to David Graeber, complete fiction. It never happened. For centuries, anthropologists and explorers have scoured the globe looking for this mythical land of barter, where people routinely swapped goods directly. They've never found it, not even once. Graeber shows that all the actual evidence points in a completely different direction. That economics textbook story isn't history. It's a fairy tale designed to make a particular worldview seem natural and inevitable. So if money didn't emerge from barter, where did it actually come from? Let's revisit our baker and shoemaker. We'll call them Henry and Joshua. They live in a small, tight-knit village. Henry needs shoes, but Joshua doesn't want bread right now. According to the textbook, they're stuck. But what would really happen? Well, they're neighbors. Henry would just walk over and say, "Hey, can I grab a pair of those shoes?" And Joshua, knowing Henry's a stand-up guy, would probably respond, "Sure thing, pay me back whenever." Done. Henry now owes Joshua one. One what, exactly? That's where it gets interesting. Maybe next week Henry bakes an amazing birthday cake for Joshua's daughter. Maybe 6 months later, Joshua needs help fixing his fence, and Henry shows up with tools and a six-pack. In real communities, people don't operate like calculating machines. They navigate a complex web of favors, gifts, and obligations. Nobody's keeping a precise scorecard. They just know they're connected by countless little debts flowing in all directions. This, Graeber argues, is how human society actually works. He calls it everyday communism. Not the political system, but the simple principle of from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. It's how you treat close friends and family. When your friend asks you to pass the salt at dinner, you don't demand payment, you just pass it. When a stranger asks for directions, you help. It's the invisible foundation of all social life, the assumption that unless we're enemies, we'll look out for each other. In this world of favors and mutual support, the double coincidence of wants just evaporates. So does the need for physical cash. What you have instead is credit. The first money wasn't coins or bills, Graeber insists. It was virtual. It was the IOU, the memory of a promise, the knowledge that you owe someone and they trust you'll make it right. This completely flips economics on its head. We didn't evolve from barter to money to credit. We started with credit. Hard currency came much, much later. And barter? That's not the origin of money at all. Barter, Graeber demonstrates, is what people who normally use money do when they suddenly don't have any. It's what happens between strangers, or even enemies, who have zero interest in an ongoing relationship. It's often suspicious, tense, ritualized, sometimes threatening. It's what you do with people you don't trust. With neighbors, you just trust they'll remember. So the real question becomes, how did this world of informal favors transform into a world of cold, calculated numerical debt? How did Henry owes me $1 become Henry owes me $40,000 at 12% interest, and if he doesn't pay, we'll take his house? This is the book's central mystery, and the answer is both simple and deeply disturbing: violence. To convert a moral obligation into a numerical debt, you need two things. You need to strip away the personal element, and you need to make it enforceable through force. Both require violence. Think about what separates debt from other promises. A debt can be precisely measured. It's not a vague favor, it's an exact number. This mathematical precision is what allows debt to be bought and sold. Your friend owing you a favor is personal and non-transferable. But if you owe a bank $1,000, that bank can sell your debt to another bank without you even knowing. The human connection is surgically removed. Where does this cold quantification come from? Graeber argues it doesn't emerge from friendly exchanges. It comes from the opposite: injury and revenge. Imagine Henry's pig escapes and destroys Joshua's garden. Joshua is furious. They get into a fight, and Henry accidentally breaks Joshua's arm. Now things are serious. Without resolution, their families could spiral into a blood feud lasting generations. The community has to intervene. They need to determine exactly what Henry owes Joshua to make things right. This is when people become legalistic and precise. This is when calculation begins. How much is a ruined garden worth? What's the price of a broken arm? Ancient legal codes, from Hammurabi's laws in Babylon to early Irish and Welsh systems, are filled with incredibly detailed lists, specifying exact compensations for every conceivable injury. So much for a lost eye, so much for a severed finger, so much for a head wound that exposes the brain. This is where money as a unit of account becomes essential. You need a way to compare different things, cows, grain, silver, to establish fair compensation. These early forms of money were what Graeber calls social currencies. They weren't for buying everyday stuff like bread or eggs. They were for rearranging relationships between people, especially when violence had broken those relationships. They paid blood wealth to prevent feuds, or bride wealth to arrange marriages. This leads to the book's most profound insight about money. In these human economies, as Graeber terms them, human life is the ultimate value, unique and incomparable. So what happens in a marriage arrangement? A man's family gives cattle, whale teeth, or brass rods, to the woman's family. Colonial observers called this bride price, assuming the man was buying his wife like property. Anthropologists objected, pointing out you're not purchasing a person you can later resell. You're creating a relationship, a bond between families. Graeber pushes this further. The payment isn't really payment at all. It's a token acknowledging a debt that can never be truly paid. You're taking someone's daughter, their sister, a person of infinite value. The only thing genuinely equivalent to a human life is another human life. The cattle or whale teeth symbolize recognition of an unpayable obligation. The same applies to blood wealth. If you kill someone, you owe a life. Offering payment says, we know we owe you a life and we know this payment isn't a life, but it acknowledges this infinite debt and we're asking you to accept it so we can restore peace. Money, in these human economies, begins as a symbol of human life's sacred value. It marks debts too profound to ever be fully repaid. So how did this sacred symbol become a tool of oppression? This transformation happens when human economies collide with what Graeber calls commercial economies, systems built on impersonal markets, driven by profit and backed by state power. Historically, this collision is almost always driven by war and slavery. A slave, Graeber explains, is someone ripped from their context, torn from family, community, all the relationships that made them a unique person. In a real sense, they're socially dead. Because they've been reduced to an isolated object, they can be bought and sold like any commodity. The value of a slave becomes a standard for measuring other things. In ancient Ireland, the standard currency unit was the cumul, literally meaning, a female slave. A king's honor was valued at 7 cumuls. What does it mean when the highest measure of a sacred person's honor is calculated in units representing people with no honor at all? It means honor is a zero-sum game, built on degrading others. This is the dark secret at the heart of our economic history. Money's real origins aren't in peaceful barter but in war, theft, and slavery. Violence first rips people from their social worlds and transforms them into tradable objects. Violence first converts human relationships into cold mathematics. With this foundation established, Graeber takes us on a sweeping 5,000-year tour, revealing a startling pattern. Human history, he argues, follows a great rhythm, an alternation between ages dominated by credit money and ages dominated by physical gold and silver. Then comes what philosopher Karl Jaspers called the Axial Age, roughly 800 BC to 600 AD. This is the era of Buddha, Confucius, and Socrates. Not coincidentally, it's also when coinage was invented. Coins emerged almost simultaneously in Greece, India, and China, each time linked to rising professional armies and massive warfare. Credit money runs on trust, but a heavily armed soldier is the definition of a terrible credit risk. Soldiers need payment they can carry anywhere, and that will be accepted without questions. Bullion is perfect, impersonal, and portable. It's the money of war and plunder. This period saw the rise of what Graeber calls the military coinage slavery complex. States minted coins to pay soldiers. Soldiers often got paid with loot from conquered cities. Conquest produced slaves, who were forced to work in mines extracting more gold and silver to mint more coins to pay more soldiers. A self-perpetuating cycle of violence. In this world of impersonal cash markets and constant warfare, the great philosophical and religious traditions were born. They were, in many ways, reactions against it. They introduced a new materialism, the idea that the world is made of abstract, quantifiable substance, like money. But they also introduced a concept of a spiritual realm beyond the material, where market calculations had no place. These were peace movements that universally preached charity and condemned usury. For the first time, greed and generosity were seen as opposing moral forces. After the collapse of the great ancient empires, Rome in the West, the Mauryan Empire in India, the Han Dynasty in China, the world entered the Middle Ages roughly 600 to 1450 AD, and the great cycle swung back. the military coinage slavery complex disintegrated. Gold and silver largely vanished from circulation, locked in monastery, temple, and church treasuries. Economic life once again became dominated by virtual credit money. In Europe, people kept accounts in old Roman currency, but actual transactions used tallies, promissory notes, and local trust arrangements. In the Islamic world, vibrant commerce flourished almost entirely on credit instruments like the sakk, the origin of our word check. In China, Buddhist monasteries became the first great centers of concentrated capital, pioneering complex financial instruments and even inventing paper money. Everywhere, dominant institutions were religious, and everywhere, these religious authorities made it their mission to regulate economic life, protect debtors, and strictly forbid usury. Islam banned all interest on loans. The Catholic Church declared usury a mortal sin, threatening moneylenders with excommunication and eternal damnation. Chinese governments repeatedly intervened to relieve indebted peasants. For most of the world's population, this was a massive improvement over the Axial Age's brutality. But around 1450, the cycle turned again. We entered the age of the great capitalist empires. It began with a crisis. Medieval credit systems were breaking down. Bullion was scarce. Then came the so-called Age of Exploration. European adventurers, backed by a new fusion of warrior and merchant interests, set out hunting for new gold and silver sources. What they found in the Americas was a windfall beyond imagination. The conquest of Mexico and Peru unleashed a tsunami of bullion into the global economy. But here's the thing. Very little stayed in Europe. The vast majority of American silver was shipped across oceans to China. Why? Because around the same time, the Ming Dynasty had abandoned its paper money experiment and based its tax system on silver, creating nearly insatiable demand. The modern world economy, Graeber argues, was born not from the Industrial Revolution, but from this vast global silver flow. It created interconnected empires, driven by relentless profit pursuit. And it brought back, with a vengeance, all the Axial Age elements. We saw the return of massive standing armies, predatory warfare, and chattel slavery on an unprecedented scale. The Atlantic slave trade can be seen as a gigantic debt chain, stretching from European financiers to African traders, turning human economies into massive machines for destroying human beings. Back in Europe, old communal trust systems were systematically demolished. Credit, once society's fabric, was criminalized. Interest-bearing loans, formerly a mortal sin, became the economy's engine. The state, which in the Middle Ages had often been kept at arm's length, now intervened with brutal force. Vagrancy became punishable by death. Debtors were thrown into nightmarish prisons. The endless accumulation of wealth was no longer vice, but the very point of human existence. This is the world that created modern capitalism. It wasn't a peaceful, gradual evolution. It was a violent transformation that remade our deepest ideas about freedom, justice, and human nature. Even our concept of liberty, Graeber shows, comes from Roman slave law. The freedom of the market is, at its root, the freedom of a master to do whatever he wants with his property, including his human property. Finally, we reach our current era, which began on August 15, 1971. On that day, President Richard Nixon announced that the U.S. dollar would no longer be convertible to gold. With that single act, the world's last link to bullion-based currency was severed. The great 500-year cycle had ended. We've returned, once again, to an age of virtual credit money. But this time, it's different. The new global credit money isn't based on community trust, but on national debt. And at its core lies the United States national debt, a debt that can never be repaid. The U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency, the ultimate store of value, not because of gold bars in Fort Knox, but because the U.S. government maintains over 800 military bases and can drop a bomb anywhere on the planet. Our money is a promise backed, ultimately, by a threat. The new global institutions emerging in this era, the IMF, the World Bank, aren't designed to protect debtors like medieval religious institutions. They're designed to protect creditors. They operate on the principle that unless you're the United States Treasury, you must pay your debts, regardless of human cost. This has created a world where almost everyone is in debt. From American students drowning in loans, to homeowners facing foreclosure, to entire nations in the global South, caught in perpetual debt traps. We've been taught to think of this as a moral issue, that being in debt makes you a sinner, and paying your debts is the essence of virtue. But as Graeber's 5,000-year history reveals, this is a lie. Debt is not a sin, it's the perversion of a promise, corrupted by mathematics and violence. The relentless drive to transform all human relationships into quantifiable transactions has created a system that's not only morally bankrupt, but now threatening to destroy itself. The 2008 financial crisis starkly reminded us of this. It was a moment when the entire edifice of imaginary money came crashing down. The system was exposed as a giant scam, built on reckless speculation, where perpetrators knew they could force victims to bail them out. In the aftermath, we were told we all had to tighten our belts, that we all had to pay for the crisis. But we didn't all pay. The financiers were rescued. The debtors were not. The sacred principle that one must always pay one's debts was exposed, for everyone to see, as a tool of power. It applies to the weak, never to the strong. So what do we take from this epic journey through 5,000 years? It's a massive amount of information, but here's the essence. The way we think about debt isn't natural or inevitable. It's a product of a very specific, very violent history. The most powerful lesson in debt is demolishing the idea that morality means paying what you owe. Graeber forces us to ask a much deeper question: who really owes what to whom? Think about it in your own life. We're told we have a debt to society, to our country, to the economy. But what about the debt society owes us? What about the promise of a world where children can grow up without being crushed by their parents' financial burdens? What about the promise, as Martin Luther King Jr. so eloquently put it, of a check that doesn't come back marked insufficient funds? This book matters today because we're living through another great transformation. The system governing the world for the last 40 years is clearly breaking down. The age of American debt imperialism is ending. We're at a crossroads, a moment when new ideas and new possibilities are back on the table. But to seize them, we have to break free from the intellectual cages built around us. So what can we actually do? How can we apply these lessons in our own lives? First, start questioning the language of debt everywhere you encounter it. When you hear politicians talk about national debt or pundits demand austerity, remember the history. Remember, these aren't neutral economic terms. They're moral and political arguments that almost always serve the powerful. Second, consciously embrace and expand the everyday communism Graeber identifies as the true foundation of social life. Recognize that your most meaningful relationships with family, friends, community aren't based on transactions. They're built on mutual aid, on an uncalculated willingness to support each other. These aren't debts to be repaid. They're life itself. The more we build our world on this principle, the less power debt's cold logic has over us. Finally, dare to imagine a different future. The book ends with a call for a modern-day jubilee, a clean slate for both international and consumer debt. This isn't naive fantasy. It's recognizing that these debts are human arrangements, and what humans arranged, they can rearrange. Wiping the slate clean wouldn't just relieve immense suffering. It would be a declaration that we're not slaves to our history. It would affirm that freedom isn't about the right to pay our debts, but about the right to decide, together, what we truly owe one another. That was the book summary of Debt, The First 5,000 Years by David Graeber. We've explored the sweep of his argument today, but a summary is like looking at a map of a vast, beautiful country. It shows you borders, major cities, rivers, but can't convey the feeling of walking through its forests or meeting its people. The real magic of this book lies in the details, the strange and wonderful stories, the startling connections, the moments when a single sentence changes how you see everything. If anything we've discussed sparked your curiosity, I urge you to pick up a copy. It's more than a book. It's an intellectual adventure that will arm you with a new way of seeing the world and your place in it. The link is in the description. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss our next journey into another life-changing book. Your support helps us bring these powerful ideas to more people. Let's keep growing together.